Hey everybody, welcome back to our D&D game. I'm your host, the Dungeon Master, or DM for short. And the way I usually make these videos is before I make a video, I will talk to the people who played in the game, and I'll ask them what they remember. And we try to remember everything that we can, and I take notes and stuff. And if I have any game notes about that game, I get those together, and then I record a video. This was the last game we played in Madison before we moved, and I lost my game notes in the move. I talked to my players about this, and they basically just have a vague memory. Everybody just has like a vague memory of the event. Nobody can really remember the specifics. So, because of all that, unfortunately, even though this is up until now the penultimate episode, the specifics are lost to the ages. So I'll just say this. I was playing Arthur. Barbara was playing Ruby, the dwarf. Well, everybody's an immortal now, right? Arthur was sort of had become the king of the elves. Ruby was like the queen of the dwarves. Breg was the quickling werewolf who became kind of like our Mercury or Hermes type character. And then Hebishi was a mongoose. Um so the idea is, because this was the final adventure of that campaign, the more pieces of the Rod of Seven Parts you get, um the more you were guided to the remaining pieces. So there's one piece left, and that is the purple piece. Um because the pieces in order were the Roy G. Biv thing. And so the last one is violet. And it's in this pit. It is a massive, desolate pit. And basically, imagine strip mining on a really cinematic scale, right? And I mean centuries and centuries and centuries of mining. And they keep digging this hole deeper and they keep digging this hole wider. And so the very bottom of the hole, because um, there's sort of a road that if you were looking down on it from the top, it would be like a swirl, you know? And it's because the road starts at the deepest part of the pit and it winds around and it moves further and further out. And as it moves away from the center, you're also getting higher as far as the ground goes. And so there's this kind of desolate shanty town built in here. And the lower you go, sort of the newer the buildings are, right? And at any rate, the people here are perpetually covered in like mud and ice, and they're miserable. And at any rate, so there's a there's a place where they bury their dead. It's a cave, and you go through this crypt and into a dungeon. And the theme here is undead. Everything's undead. And once you kill everything, um, the treasure at the end of that dungeon is the purple rod, right? So Habishi's got the rest of this kind of like, and it was just my choice as GM because I was intentionally leaning into the Infinity Gauntlet idea, where each gem is a different color. So she puts it together, and so now the rod of 7 parts is like prismatic, basically. And as soon as this happens, it just sort of sends almost like a shock wave through reality, right? And throughout this campaign, we mentioned earlier that the Queen of Chaos, who's an immortal, she wants it so that she can rescue Miska the wolf spider, who was her lover. And she commanded an army of were spiders who were very, very tough to beat. And then there was Ma Yuan, and he was this kind of like a lizard man immortal. He had the head of a T-Rex. He had 3 eyes and 4 arms, and he had a lot of lizard folk who were his followers. And so he's been sending them to attack the PCs. And since Hebishi is a mongoose and a mongoose is good at killing snakes, she has been dealing with the lizard folk a lot, right? And Arthur too. Arthur hates snakes. At any rate, and of course, classically, King Arthur slaying dragons, just it's a good fit. At any rate. And then Breg, the Quickling, has been dealing a lot with these ogres, and they are followers of Vaprak the Destroyer, who's also an immortal. So when they put the rod 7 parts together, Vaprak the Destroyer, Ma Yuan, and the Queen of Chaos all show up, right? And the thing is, they are not a united front. They don't have teamwork. I don't want to sound preachy, or like an after-school special, but it's true. They all have a different reason for wanting it, right? And the heroes, Arthur, Breg, Hebishi, Ruby, they all want the exact same thing, which is they want to save the world. They're helping one another, they're working together, so on and so forth, right? So, Ma Yuan attacks Hebishi. Vaprak attacks Breg. The Queen of Chaos attacks Ruby, right? And they fight, and they have this huge battle, and it's just insane. And the people in the pit leave. For the first time in ages, they just evacuate and they abandon the pit. And so, for instance, when they are these like cosmic level energy blasts and stuff getting hurled around, if you did that on level ground, that blast would continue for a ways and maybe hurt somebody. You know what I mean? These guys are destroying the village in here, the town, the shanty town. It's being utterly and completely wiped out. But all of the rock and stuff, the blast doesn't get too far into the rock. I mean, mind you, they're making the hole bigger, right? But they're not like destroying the world as collateral damage. You know what I mean? So it is just this big, epic battle, in every sense of the word epic. And for the battle, we were using um third edition Dungeons and Dragons. Um Scott was not playing because he was helping out with rules stuff. I like to run a lot of games where you kind of have two dungeon masters, by the way. One is basically the lead dungeon master where he's all about story, And then the secondary dungeon master is your rules lawyer guy who just focuses on who has what hit points, how does this spell work, so on and so forth. So Scott was really good at that. At any rate, massive fight, and all three of these evil immortals are quote unquote killed. Now, according to the Wrath of the Immortals box set, they are banished to their home plane for a number of days equal to their hit points. Nonetheless, they're banished, and because they are gone, um, they what am I wanting to say? They kind of learned their lesson. This particular trio never teams up again to attempt the same thing again, right? Now that they're gone, though, it's time for the main course, right? And that is Thanatos, the god of death, and he is just hardcore. He looks like the Grim Reaper. Um, he, attacks the heroes. They fight him, and they have a really difficult time beating him. And at least it's four immortals against one immortal, right? But he's a high level immortal. So they fight and they defeat him. The good guys win. So he too is banished for a period of time. And like I say, this was the end of a campaign. So Hebishi, who her and Arthur had this thing that was like a will they, won't they, moonlighting kind of a thing, they finally hook up. Um, he ends up getting her pregnant, and they have a daughter named Nadawe Kata, and she is also an immortal and also has a distaste for reptiles. Um, so she, grows up and has adventures of her own. Um, Breg decides to sort of travel through space, and he is looking for basically um the home of the elves, you know. And he's doing kind of diplomatic stuff where he wants, because like the fairy folk is this sort of umbrella term for a wide range of races. Nymphs, pixies, um, all sorts of stuff. Elves, fairies, grigs, you know, dryads. They're all related, you know, in our game world anyways. They're all related, but they're not very unified. And so what Bragg tries to do is bring people together more, including the quicklings. I mentioned Ruby before. Ruby brings the elves and the dwarves closer together. Things aren't perfect there, but things are better than they would be if Ruby was never born. um and just as Bragg is traveling through space, right, we end this one with Arthur traveling through time. And we mentioned that before, that Arthur, at one point, he's in ancient Ireland. At one point, he's responsible for the story of Beowulf. At one point, he inspires Shakespeare to write A Midsummer Night's Dream, and he's the inspiration for Oberon, while Morrigan is the inspiration for Titania. Um, he ends up in the Old West. We did some adventures there. There's actually a Civil War character named Bob who gets bitten by a vampire. So Bob the Vampire was was part of a Old West game I was running that was a lot of fun. Very weird by D&D standards, but it was a lot of fun. Um, at any rate, but what we end with is he goes to um the night that Merlin took them camping, which on this channel, that's episode number 1. So Arthur, the adult immortal Arthur, is in the woods that night, and he has access to basically all the D&D spells, like I said before, so he uses invisibility. And he's watching his younger self at the campfire with his friends, talking and laughing and making s'mores and stuff like that, you know. And he remembers that all of those other boys died in the course of their adventures. Merlin at one point senses the presence of the immortal, and he stands up and says it's time. And he walks into the fog where the boys can't see him or can't hear him or anything. And the boys go back to talking and everything. And that's exactly how Arthur remembers it going. And Arthur tells him, the kind of stuff that happened to him, what his life was like, so on and so forth. And they end up traveling through time, Arthur and Merlin. And Merlin's fate is eventually to be trapped and never seen again. Merlin actually knows what happens to him to an extent. So Arthur takes him to other time periods and shows him all the stuff he didn't see, like the Old West and things like that. And at any rate, they go back, and when they get back to the foggy forest, the boys are all asleep. And so at any rate, there's a clone spell. Arthur clones the other boys and takes them with him. Well, I said that wrong. He takes the originals with him. The only original that Merlin sends back in time is Arthur. The other boys were all clones. So the next morning, the real boys wake up in the 20th century, right? At the campsite. And Arthur has completely recreated all of their camping equipment, stuff like that. But Merlin is the one who's gone. So the boys go back to the town, the nearest town. And we mentioned there was a little store there, and they had a cooler, and there were milk cartons in the store with pictures of the Dungeons and Dragons kids on the milk cartons, the missing kids thing. And so Arthur, because as an immortal, he can appear however he wants, right? He chooses to appear as he did originally, as Artie in episode 1, as a kid. He's a kid again. And he tells the person in the convenience store that the guy who took him camping has gone missing, and they need to talk to the cops. So they report that Merlin went missing. The cops search the forest. They actually find Arthur's adult footprints. So they're looking for a big 6.5 foot guy that they think took Merle Lincoln. Merle ends up on milk cartons. The boys get to go home. The boys get a happy ending, including Artie. Little Artie goes home. And this is what he has wanted for so long. And he sees his family again, he sees his mom again. Um, he sees his grandparents, so on and so forth. And he hugs everybody and they're surprised. They're like, "You only went camping for like the weekend. You act like you haven't seen us for years," that kind of thing. And and at any rate, in the weeks to come, his friends come over and little they camp out in the backyard and they sit around the fire and they tell stories, and they're familiar stories that through the centuries, these familiar stories have been passed down from person to person. And Artie recognizes the things that are true, and for the things that aren't true, that have been distorted through the ages, he just kind of keeps his mouth shut. And he lives there for a while. He lives out his life until his mom dies. She, eventually passes away. His grandparents eventually pass away, and then he leaves. That'd be a story for another time. But from the viewpoint of his family, they never miss Artie. They get him in their life for the rest of their lives. So I think that's a good place to stop. Um, and yes, as of the 20th century, Thanatos has not returned, so on and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed this one. If so, be sure to smash that like button. It really helps out the channel. Hit subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, leave a comment, all that jazz. And we will see you in the next one. Bye.